is talking about the Syro-Malabar Church. And so, just for those who don't know, might be a bit new to these kinds of conversations, the Catholic Church is not just made up of the Latin Rite. So, we talked about the Latin Rite, the Latin Church, but there's actually different entities that are really self governing, even though they're still under the Pope, known as particular churches. They're mainly dealing with churches in the East that are historic Christian communities that are in union with the Holy Father. And the third largest one, largest church in general, behind the Greek Catholics, the Byzantine Catholics, as they're often called, are called the Syro-Malabar. Now, the Syro-Malabar are in India, the southwest of India. And there's disputed claims about their origins, but they typically find their origins in the actual people that were evangelized by St. Thomas. Tradition went that St. Thomas the Apostle went to India and evangelized to the Indians there, and established what were called the St. Thomas Christians. That's very disputed. There's very little facts to actually go into that. There are medieval documents from the West, from monks that traveled back and forth, and they said that the people in India claimed to be St. Thomas Christians. But what is certain is that they were eventually evangelized, or the community spread there from the Syriac Christians, which is where the Syro-Malabar find their origins. So that's a group of Christianity that developed in Mesopotamia. They had their own literature. They had their own spirituality. St. Ephrem the Syrian, who we talked about a few shows ago, he's the most well-known members of that school, the school that was at a place called Edessa. They had a bunch of literature that came out from there, beautiful Christian literature. And they also had their own liturgy. And that developed at that same school in Edessa, which is now in southern Turkey, northern Syria. Now, many of those Christians in the 3rd and 4th century, they weren't loyal to the Roman Empire. At least they were very skeptical to the Roman Empire. Many of them were actually from a place called Persia, which is now Iran. And they were loyal to what was called the Sasanian Empire, the Persian Empire, and they were really looking for any chance they could get to not be under the empire and be under another authority. And a opportunity presented itself when the Patriarch of Constantinople, named Nestorius, was excommunicated. Many people who were close to Nestorius were from these Syriac, close to Persia communities, and they went off and really it started spreading a more independent church. We now call that the Church of the East, not the Eastern Orthodox, but a different community entirely, called the Church of the East, or the Nestorian communities. And eventually that schism got really solidified after, not only when the Muslims invaded and they got completely isolated, the hierarchy of their church fell apart, but also as the actual heresy of Nestorianism started spreading within that Eastern Syriac church, which again had a legitimate liturgy, had legitimate practices. But anyways, they eventually spread the faith through Syrian traders, Traders, traders who went over to India trying to sell goods. They brought the faith with them. They brought their traditions with them. And so when the Portuguese arrived, colonizing India in around the 16th, 17th century, they found these Christians there who were following this Eastern Syriac tradition, who were very different from Latin Rite or even Eastern Catholics. For example, they wouldn't use images, very similar to what the Nestorians were doing. They didn't even have determined vestments. The hierarchy in the region completely fell apart. And so when the Portuguese got there, they saw these local traditions of these Christians, and they said, we're going to Latinize it. So they introduced Latin vestments. They introduced in some places it was even bringing in Gregorian chant, bringing in the Latin liturgy, but in general it was making that Eastern Syriac liturgy look a lot more like the Latin Mass. And some of those things, again, were good, like solidifying that they have to wear vestments, or at least some kind of vestments. But others, some people say it went too far. And it started this trend that we saw even going up until today of this struggle between, is it going to be a Syriac liturgy? Is it going to be something more like the Latin Mass? So that was the back and forth up until the Second Vatican Council. The Second Vatican Council really threw a wrench in things because with the document Sacrosanctum Concilium, people don't realize this, but and there is debate about this. The document statements in general in the Second Vatican Council, Sacrosanctum Concilium, which is on the liturgy, is not restricted to the Western Church. Most of the hierarchy saw it that way. Some of the things, like Gregorian chant, for example, that's talking about the Latin Church. But the big sweeping generalizations, like the liturgy needs to be made closer to the people, and also that it needs to be prioritized being in the vernacular, that was meant for the entire church. And these people had the hierarchy had it in mind that the Eastern Catholic churches would also reform their liturgies at a certain point. And many people completely understood that in these Eastern communities, even though that's completely at odds really to what they should be all about. And what did we see? They bring out the Cranmer table, facing the people. It's all made in the vernacular. You get modern music brought into things. The same stuff we see at your modern Novus Ordo Mass. So this got brought into the equation. Those who wanted the Eastern Syriac Mass to be more like the Latin Mass now wanted it to be more like the Novus Ordo following Vatican II. Here's the ironic part, and here's where it gets very complicated. Of course, what is going on at the same time of trying to get the liturgical reform, and what is another big part of the Second Vatican Council? Well, the post-conciliar popes want ecumenism. It's very difficult to promote to the Eastern Orthodox and the Church of the East and the Miaphysites, come into union with Rome, but you're going to have to change your liturgy to make it look like the Novus Ordo, which many of you hate. So, surprisingly, there's been this debate of should we have this Novus Ordoized Syro-Malabar liturgy facing the people, etc., or should we have a more traditional Eastern Syriac facing east? It looks a whole lot more like the Eastern Syriac. Rome actually came on the side of the traditionalists, really motivated by that ecumenical desire of not wanting to rock the boat with these Eastern communities. We've seen the popes, both Pope Francis and now Pope Leo, talk about how the Eastern Church is so venerable in its liturgical practices. Well, that's what's motivating that. And it looked like there was going to be a schism. There's been schisms over this in the past, over in the 17th century. There's been people who went outside of the communion with Rome, went and joined the Oriental Orthodox. Well, we thought that was going to happen again. Well, there's been a resolution this month, and it is agreed, the compromise is that they would celebrate Mass facing the people during the Liturgy of the Word. That in and of itself is kind of a strange term to use in the context of the Syriac liturgy. But basically what we would think of the Liturgy of the Word, the first half of the Mass, they would be facing the people. And during the Liturgy of the Eucharist, they would face the altar, face east, and ad orientem. And then now the priest will also face the people after the communion. So that's the resolution, and both sides have agreed to it. And now the Pope has even withdrawn some of the overseers from the regions, which shows that this is really a done deal. It seems like that's going to be a permanent solution. And so finally, I want to just give my 2 cents on this. What I really think this shows is that this is the problem when we think that the hierarchy, the Pope, can just make up a liturgy, and we can start being like these liturgy people and thinking we can just, get out our napkins, get out our pieces of paper and start writing down liturgy to be more perfect. You're going to end up with an endless regression because nobody knows what is this perfect liturgy, this Platonic form of a liturgy. Rather, what the church has really always seen this as these rites, these venerable rites, have been received and approved by the church. And really, the hierarchy shouldn't be making up new ones, nor should we be messing with them. This is something that has been delivered on over thousands of years, and even the Pope has no business meddling in trying to come up with new liturgies, come up with new ways of making the Mass more participatory, even though that hasn't worked at all since the Second Vatican Council. That goes back to that whole point of you need to prove whether or not this works or not, and it certainly hasn't. And so in this case, I think it shows the danger that this constant liturgical tinkering faces, not just to the West, but also the East. And finally, it shows the double standard. If all of these liturgical reforms were so good, which Sacrosanctum Concilium even, it seems to suggest that, and the implementation of Sacrosanctum Concilium seems to suggest what we saw in the Novus Ordo was completely good. It's completely to what the Council Fathers were envisioning. Well, if all these reforms have been good and they've been so fruitful, why wouldn't we enforce it on the Eastern churches? There's a contradiction involved in saying that the Eastern churches are so venerable in their liturgy, but our modern reforms that we made to the West cannot be implemented there without ruining something that is pristine. I think we can say maybe we've ruined some things in the West by trying to do those same reforms here, and we should look to the same principle we're looking to preserve the Eastern rites as well.